Hi everyone, my name is Irina Zabriskie and I'm honored to welcome you to Globus Books virtual living room and YouTube channel. Globus Books has been established in San Francisco in 1971. It's a bookstore that specializes in Russian language, literature, philosophy, history, all sort of books that go on the subject of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. If you are ever in San Francisco, please stop by. We are reopening on Monday, June 15th, after 3 months almost. We're totally equipped to do it safely. So if you are in San Francisco, you are very welcome to stop by. And today we are very happy to welcome Alex Cigale, who will introduce us to work of some major Russian writers of the beginning of the former century. And I'm personally very excited to hear work of Anatoly Mariengof, because while Daniil Kharms is better known, and it's always great to hear his work. Anatoly Mariengof sometimes is only being presented as a best friend of poet Sergei Yesenin, and he has significant body of work, especially his novel Cynics that Alex is going to read from, which definitely deserves all the attention. And famously, Joseph Brodsky thought or said once that that was the greatest Russian novel ever written. So I'm happy to introduce Alex Cigale, who is an award-winning poetry translator and literary translator, a poet with over 300 publications in literary journals. He is currently teaching at the CUNY, Queen's College, and he is also a literature panelist at the New York State Council on the Arts.
Okay, so you guys may have heard of the Russian Futurists. Mayakovsky may be the one name that everyone has heard. And so it was actually Zarina's idea to pair these two, and I thought that was wonderful. So Marienhof was the youngest member of that generation. He was still in his teens. He was, I think, exactly 20 when he came to prominence in 1917, right around the revolution. He was scandalous. If any of you guys know the history of modernism and poetry, one of the earliest movements started by Pound was called imagism, right? Which William Carlos Williams, the American poet, identified as no ideas but in things, sort of like very concrete imagery. But the Russian version of that imaginism had nothing to do with the American version. The Russians love to take something and adapt it to their own. So they took the name, but it was still the concentration focus on the image. But what they did was to try to push metaphor to its absurd, extreme limits. And so when I get to Marienhof in the second half of the program, that's one of the things that I kind of will like you to pay attention to. Now, he was the youngest member. He was 15 years younger than the oldest members, David Burluk. So he was born in 1897, 4 years younger than Mayakovsky, who was the youngest of the major members. And it was already too late. Everything was sort of cracked down. He was vilified by the Soviets as they're decadent. The futurists were decadent. And he then published these 3 novellas that he's primarily known for. They were only published in Berlin in the late 1920s. And then things really got cracked down on it. He never was able to publish anything really in the rest of his life. He worked in television and theater for the rest of his life, had a couple of plays produced, and then was forgotten for nearly half a century. Kharms was a teenager at the time. He was born in 1905. And so when he got started in the late 1920s, again, there were these scandalous performances that were immediately shut down. And he kept on writing poetry, however, but again, he switched to these mostly miniatures, sort of like, these kind of anecdotes or vignettes. Kharms was not published in Russia until 1984. And what I would like to do today is something I've never done before, and that's read his one long work, which is probably the best known one. It's called Starucha, the old woman, or the old crone. But I want to do it with a twist. So it is a long, short story. But when I had a chance to teach it once in my classes, and it was actually in my history of Russian theater class. Now, again, and this was suggested to me in a way, but by something that Zarina said. Zarina said that these things, especially with Mariengof, she said, are very adaptable to the stage. So we arranged this short story as a play with speaking parts, and it seemed to naturally break into 3 acts with a prelude and a coda. And so I'm hoping to read about maybe half of this short story, starting with the prelude, and then a couple of the acts maybe, and the coda. I had my students write introductions to every act, sort of, so I'll actually incorporate those as a way of kind of summarizing the action. Starucha by Daniil Kharms. Prelude. An old crone is standing in the yard, holding a wall clock in her arms. I walk past the old woman, stop and ask her, "What time is it?" "Have a look," she says. I look closer and see that the clock is missing its hands. "There are no hands," I say. The old woman looks at the clock face and says, "It is now 2:45. "Is that so?" I say, and take my leave. The old woman yells something after me, but I walk on without glancing back. I exit into the street and walk on the sunlit side. The spring sun feels simply wonderful. I am walking, squinting my eyes and smoking a pipe. At the corner of the garden ring, I cross paths with Sardon Mikhailovich. Walking towards me, we greet each other, stop and chat for a long while. I become bored of standing in the street and invite Sardon Mikhailovich to accompany me inside a rathskeller. We drink vodka, chasing it down with hard-boiled eggs and salted fish, then say farewell, and I continue on my way alone. Then I suddenly remembered that I had forgotten to turn off the electric heater in my house. I turned around and walked back home. The day had begun so well, and here already is the first misfortune. I should not have wandered away. Act 1. The narrator returns to his apartment, dimly lit, with minimal furniture. He has an old decrepit daybed with rips and stains. His lifestyle is similar to that of the cynic Menippus, as described by Lucian of Samosata. He lives very simply, without care for monetary values. The narrator's habit is to meticulously nitpick his own actions as well as the actions of others. I come home, take off my coat, take my pocket watch out of the vest pocket, and hang it by its chain on a nail. Then I lock the door with a key and lie down on the daybed. I'll stay in bed and try to fall asleep. I can hear the loathsome cries of boys coming from the street. I lie there inventing ways to punish them. I like the idea of infecting them with tetanus best of these, so that they freeze in their tracks. And then the parents drag them to their homes. They lie in their little beds and can't even eat because they can't open their mouths. They feed them artificially. The lockjaw passes in a week, but they are so weakened that for another full month they must stay between the sheets. Then they begin to gradually improve, but I make them relapse with another bout of tetanus, and they all perish. I lie on the daybed with my eyes open and can't fall asleep. I remember the old woman with the wall clock whom I had seen in the yard today, and a sense of contentment comes over me at her clock not having any hands. Just the other day, in a consignment store, I saw the most abominable kitchen clock whose hands were made to look like a knife and fork. My lord, I still haven't turned off the electric heater off. I jump out of bed and turn it off, then again lie down on the daybed and try hard to fall asleep. I close my eyes. I don't feel like sleeping. The spring sun floods through the window and falls directly on me. I start feeling hot. I get up and sit down in the armchair by the window. Now I feel sleepy, but I will not go to sleep. I will take out paper and quill and write. I sense in myself a terrible force. I had already planned it all out yesterday. It will be the tale of a miracle maker who lives in our times and doesn't perform any miracles. He knows that he's a miracle maker and that he can perform any miracle, but he doesn't do it. He's evicted from his apartment, and he knows that with a wave of a handkerchief, he could get his apartment back, but he doesn't do it. He meekly moves out of the apartment and lives in a barn outside of the city. He can transform this barn into a beautiful brick house, but he doesn't, and instead continues to live in the barn and finally dies, having never performed a single miracle. I sit there and rub my hands together in glee. Cesar Don Mihailovich will just die of envy. He thinks that I'm no longer capable of producing a masterpiece. I must immediately get to work. Down with all sloth and slumber, I will now write for 18 hours straight. I am practically quivering with anticipation. I can't concentrate on the things at hand. I needed to produce a quill and paper, and I was grabbing hold of various objects altogether different from the ones I intended to. I frantically paced the length of the room, from the window to the table, from the table to the wood-burning stove, from the stove back to the table, then to the couch and back again to the window. I was panting for air from the flame that was blazing in my breast. It is only 5 o'clock. Ahead of me is the entire day, the evening, and all of the night. I stand in the middle of the room. What am I thinking of? It's already 20 minutes past 5. I must write. I place the little writing table by the window and sit down at it. Before me is a pad of graphing paper, and in my hand the quill. My heart is still palpitating too much, and my hand shakes. I wait until I calm down a bit. I put the quill down and fill my pipe. The sun is shining directly into my eyes, and I squint and light the pipe. A crow flies past the window. I look out of the window onto the street and see how on the pavement walks a man with an artificial leg. He makes a racket with his leg and walking stick. A crow flies past the window. Okay, I say to myself, continuing to stare out of the window. The sun conceals itself behind the smokestack of the neighboring house. The shadow of the smokestack runs down the roof, flies across the street, and lies down on my face. I must make use of this shade and put down a few words about the miracle worker. I grab the quill and scribble, "The miracle worker was a tall fellow." I am not able to write anything more. I sit still until that time when I begin to feel hungry. Then I rise and walk over to the pantry where I keep my provisions and run my hand along all the surfaces but find nothing in it. A cube of sugar, and that's about it. Somebody's knocking at the door. Who's there? Nobody answers me. I open the door and see before me the old woman who had stood in the morning with a wall clock in the yard. I am very surprised and cannot get a word out. "So, I've come," the old woman says and enters my room. I stand by the door not knowing what to do. Do I chase the old woman out or the opposite, invite her in to sit down? But the old woman walks towards the window armchair on her own accord and plants herself in it. "Close the door and put the lock on," the old woman says. I close the door and lock it. "Get on your knees," the old woman says. I get down on my knees. But then I begin to understand how preposterous my situation is. Why am I standing on my knees before some old crone? And how did this old woman make her way into my room and is now sitting in my favorite armchair? Why did I not chase the old woman out? Now hear this, I say. Who gave you the right to issue orders in my place or even boss me around? I have no desire to be standing on my knees. You don't have to, the old woman says. Now you must lie down on your stomach and plaster your face on the floor. I immediately executed her command. I see in front of my nose precisely drawn squares. The pain in my shoulder and right hip forced me to change my position. I lie completely prone, can now raise myself to my knees only with great difficulty. The blood has pooled in all my extremities and they bend very poorly. I gaze backwards and see myself in my own room, standing on my knees in the middle of the floor. My awareness and memory slowly return to me. I look around the room once again and see that apparently someone is seated in the armchair by the window. The room is barely lit because the white nights, it seems, are beginning. I look more closely. Good Lord, could it be that the old woman is still sitting in my chair? I stretch my neck out to see better. Yes, of course, the old woman is sitting there with her head drooping down on her chest. She must have fallen asleep. I get up and, limping a bit, walk over to her. The old woman's head is lowered to her chest. Her arms are hanging down the side of the armchair. I want to grab this old crone and shove her out the door. Listen to me, I say. You're in my room. I have to work. I ask you to please leave. The old woman doesn't budge. I bend over and look at the old woman's face. Her mouth is ajar, and poking out of her mouth are her dentures that have become detached. Suddenly, everything comes perfectly clear to me. The old woman has died. I was overcome by a terrible sense of annoyance. Why did she have to die in my room? I can't stand stiffs. And now there's this hassle of dealing with this roadkill. Go have a talk with the porter, the super, explain it to them how this old woman ended up in my place. I looked at the old woman with loathing. Maybe, perhaps, she isn't dead after all. I felt her forehead. The forehead was cold. The arm also. What am I to do? I light my pipe and sit down on the daybed. A blind rage wells up in me. That bitch, I say out loud. The dead woman is sitting in my armchair like a sack of potatoes. Her teeth are protruding out of her mouth. She resembles a dead horse. What a revolting sight, I say, but can't force myself to cover the old woman with a newspaper because you never know what might happen under the newspaper. I could hear something moving on the other side of the wall. It's my neighbor, the train mechanic. It couldn't get much worse. If he were to get a whiff of what was going on, that sitting in my room was a dead old woman, I perked up my ears to hear my neighbor's steps. Why is he dawdling? It's already 5:30. He should be long gone by now. My God. He's making tea. Beyond the wall, I hear the whistle of a tea kettle. Ah, let him go off already, the damn mechanic. I climb with my feet up on the daybed and lay there. 8 minutes pass by, but the neighbor has yet to have his tea. And the kettle's still hissing. I close my eyes and doze off. I dream that my neighbor has gone out and that I can go out in the stairwell along with him and slam the door with the French lock behind me. I didn't take a key and can't get back inside the apartment. I will have to ring their bells and wake the rest of my neighbors, and this is really too much. I stand on the landing in the stairwell and think about what I should do, and suddenly I see that I'm missing my hands. I bend my head to get a closer look to check if I do have hands and see that on one side, instead of a hand, I have a table knife sticking out, and on the other side, a fork. Look at this, I say to Sacerdan Mikhailovich, who for some reason is sitting right there on a folding chair. Do you see this, I tell him, the kind of hands I have? And Sacerdan Mihailovich sits there silently, and I see that it's not the real Sacerdan Mihailovich, but a clay one. At this point, I awake and immediately understand that I'm lying in my room on the daybed, and by the window in the armchair sits a dead old woman. I quickly turn my head toward her, and the old woman's gone. I look at the empty chair and am filled with wild joy. That means it was all a dream. Only where did it begin? Did the old woman enter my room yesterday? Perhaps this too was a dream. I returned home yesterday because I forgot to turn off the electric heater, but maybe this too was a dream. In any case, how wonderful that there is no dead old crone in my room, and that means that I don't have to see the super and deal with the stiff. However, how long did I sleep? I look at the pocket watch on the wall. 9:30. Must be in the morning. Good Lord, the things one sees in dreams. I lowered my feet from the daybed and was about to get up when I saw the dead old woman lying on the floor by the table, beside the armchair. She was lying face up, and the dentures, having escaped her mouth, were hanging on by a tooth onto one of the old woman's nostrils. Her hands had become tangled underneath her and were invisible, and from under her hiked up skirt stuck out bony feet clad in dirty white woolen socks. You bitch, I screamed, and running over to her, kicked her in the chin with my boot. The dentures flew into the corner. I wanted to kick the old woman once more, but was afraid that if I leave any marks on her body, they might just decide later that I killed her. Some 20 minutes had passed in this manner. Now it became perfectly clear to me that they would, after all, turn the case into a criminal investigation anyway, and the dumb detectives will accuse me of murder. I stepped away from the old woman, sat down on the daybed, and lit my pipe. Looks like it's going to be no laughing matter, and here I am kicking her with my boots. I walked over to the old woman again, bent over her, and began examining her face. On her chin was a small dark spot. Don't think they'll try. Don't think they'll try to pin that on me. It could have been anything. The old woman could have knocked her chin on someone while she was still alive. I calmed down a bit and began to pace the room, smoking my pipe and pondering my predicament. I pace around the room and begin to feel hunger, and all the time more intense. I even begin to shiver from hunger. I rummage through the pantry where my provisions are kept one more time, but find nothing there beside the cube of sugar. I take out my wallet and count my money, 11 rubles. This means I can buy myself some ham and bread, and still have some left over for tobacco. I fix my tie that had come askew during the night, take my watch, put on my coat, carefully lock the door of my apartment, put the key in my pocket, and walk out into the street. Before anything else, I must get something to eat, then my thoughts will become clearer, and that way I'll be able to do something about this piece of carrion. And so then the action proceeds outdoors. He visits a friend, meets and falls in love with a girl, and so forth. So skipping act 2, he comes back to his apartment, and he's drunk. So I turned into the lobby of my building and started climbing the stairs. On the second floor, I stopped. A disturbing thought had come into my head. The old Cronus probably began decomposing by now. I hadn't closed the windows, and they say that corpses start decomposing faster if the windows are left open. What a nuisance. And that nincompoop of a super won't be in until tomorrow. I stood there in my hesitation for several minutes and then resumed climbing the stairs. I paused once again at the door of my apartment. Perhaps I'd better walk over to the bakery instead and wait there for that kind young lady that he'd fallen in love with. I would beg her to let me stay with her 2-3 nights. But then I remembered that she had already read, which means that she wouldn't be visiting the bakery again today, and even if she did, nothing would come of it anyway. I unlocked the door and entered the hallway. At the end of the corridor, a light shone, and Maria Vasilievna, who was holding in her hand some sort of a rag, was scrubbing it with another rag. Noticing me, Maria Vasilievna shouted, "Some old man was asking for you." So, and I should explain that these are communal apartments. People live in these luxurious old apartments that took up an entire floor in the rooms, but share the kitchen and the bathroom. What old man? I said. I can't shave, Vasily Ivanovna answered. When was this? I asked. Also can't shave, Maria Vasilyevna said. Was it you who spoke with him? I asked Maria Vasilyevna. 'Twas I, Maria Vasilyevna answered. Then how can you possibly not know what time it was? I said. Some 2 hours ago, said Maria Vasilyevna. And what did this old man look like? I asked. Also can't say, Maria Vasilyevna said, and headed towards the kitchen. I walked towards my room. What if, I thought to myself, the old woman has vanished? I will enter the room and the crone will be gone. Lordy Lord, is there really no such thing as a miracle in our day and age? I unlocked my room and began to swing the door slowly open. Perhaps if it only seemed so to me, but the sickly sweet odor of the early stages of decomposition wafted up into my face. I peeked inside the partly ajar door and for a split second froze in my tracks. The old woman was slowly crawling towards me on all fours. I slammed the door shut with a holler, turned the key, and jumped back against the opposite wall. Maria Vasilyevna appeared in the hallway once again. You want something? She asked. I was trembling so badly that I couldn't get a word out and only wagged my head to indicate no. Maria Vasilyevna approached closer. Were you speaking with someone? She said. I once again shook my head in denial. Got a screw loose, Maria Vasilyevna said, and once again headed for the kitchen, glancing over her shoulder at me several times on her way back. I mustn't stand around like this. I mustn't stand around like this. I kept repeating over and over in my mind. This unbidden phrase had composed itself somewhere deep in my bowels, and I kept muttering again and again until it floated up into my consciousness. Yes, indeed, I mustn't stand around like this, I said to myself, but continued standing there, paralyzed. Something horrifying had happened, but I was faced with the prospect of having to do something perhaps much worse than what had already occurred. My thoughts were swirling in eddies, and all I could make out were the eyes of the dead old woman slowly crawling towards me on all fours. To burst into the room and smash the old crumb's skull into smithereens, that's what I must do. I even looked around me and was happy to find a croquet mallet, which had for no discernible reason had been standing around for many years now in the corner of the corridor. All I had to do was seize the mallet, burst into the room, and whack. I was still shaking. I stood there with my shoulders raised and head retracted as though to ward off the inner cold. My thoughts were racing, becoming jumbled, returning to their point of departure, and then again begin to gallop, spreading over new domains. But I kept perfectly still, trying to listen in on my own thoughts as though I were standing outside of them and was not their captain. Stiffs are a quirky lot, my own thoughts were explaining to me. Diseased is a misnomer for them. Diseased is more like it. You always have to keep an eye out for them, morgue attendant. Why do you think they have them posted there? For one reason only, to make sure the cadavers don't crawl away. There have been many curious incidents in this respect. One stiff, while the guard was taking a bath on orders from the management, crawled out of the morgue and finding his way into the disinfection chamber, ate a pile of bed sheets there. The orderlies who worked there gave this stiff a good shellacking, but they still had to make up for the spoiled sheets out of their own pockets. And another cadaver crawled into the maternity ward and scared the expectant mothers so badly that one of them immediately dropped the preemie, a miscarriage, and the stiff pounced on the discarded fetus and started devouring it, chomping loudly. And when one brave nurse clobbered the stiff over his back with a footstool, he managed to snag this nurse's foot in his choppers, and she came down with toxic syndrome and shortly thereafter perished. Yes, stiffs are indeed a questionable lot, and one must always stay vigilant around them. Enough, I addressed my own thoughts. You're talking nonsense. Stiffs are immobile. All right then, my own thoughts were saying to me. Why don't you just go ahead and enter your room where, as you say, the immobile stiff is reposing? A sudden obstinacy welled up in me. And I will too, I said decisively to my own thoughts. Just you try, my own thoughts said to me. This mocking finally succeeded in infuriating and driving me over the edge. I grabbed the croquet mallet and flung myself at the door. Wait, my own thoughts screamed in my wake. But I had already turned the key and threw the door open. The old woman was lying prone near the threshold, her face peeled to the floor. I stood above her with a croquet mallet raised at the ready. The old woman lay still. The shivering had left me, and my thoughts were now flowing lucidly and precisely. I was once again their master. First of all, you must close the door, I commanded myself. So, that was Daniil Kharms. I've spent more than a half a lifetime with the short story, and every time I read it, the intricate pattern of things echoing and repeating, various kinds of parallels. I'm constantly discovering new things in it, in its intricate designs. You might have recognized some influences. It came to be known as the Russian absurd. His greatest hero was Lewis Carroll, of course. I hope I interested you enough in that story alone that you might read it, go out there and read it on your own. I will go ahead and now read from our other writer tonight, Anatoly Mariengof. This is my first attempt at trying to represent a novella, and it is structured in, Zarina used the cinematic eye technique in her example. Now, so it's structured in vignettes, very short little chapters. The entire book has 4 sections, one titled 1918, the second one titled 1919, then it skips a few years, 1922, and it ends with a section called 1924. Each one roughly 40 little vignettes, alternating longer section and shorter sections. I think the reason that Brodsky considered it the greatest Russian novel written is for its literary value. It is very much a poet's novella. It's just so beautifully written with all these lyrical expositions. It's beautifully written. It's beautifully structured. It tells a story that I think will be of interest. The Russian Civil War, the NEP period, the beginning of it, sort of this decadence and slaughter and starvation and everything else again. But this sort of dense elusiveness to Russian history is a particular difficulty. It's certainly not everyone's best novel. Marengof's books were not published in Russia until 1984. The novellas came out in Berlin. And Mariengof was actually a very practical man who made that compromise and worked for the official bureaucracy in radio and television. The author, the narrator, is an erudite who is incredibly pedantic. He collects first editions and is constantly citing these classical sources, medieval sources, and so on. And that is one of the greatest difficulties of translating this novel. He's also constantly contrasting the past with the present. The past is constantly intruding on the present. And so I thought that would be a good way to represent some part of it, because otherwise, right, I can't. The book is about half the length of a novel, about 120 pages or 150 pages. And it's so fragmented, inspired very much by, if you can imagine, the newsreels that used to be shown right in the movies before So you have these splices of what's going on in revolutionary and Civil War Russia, juxtaposed with a love story. And there are some supporting characters. So the main character's name is Vladimir. His love is Olga. These are the two most common Russian names that are intended to represent Russia as a whole. And Vladimir has a brother who is I think, a geologist, and so he was made a commissar. Olga comes from a wealthy family. Her parents have run away abroad, and her brother has gone off to fight with the Tsarist White Russians. He's a teenager. This is not published yet, and one of the things feedback I get from peer reviews is that it has to be intensely annotated, but this is not how it was written. Right, the whole thing is about pedanticism. It does not really matter what all the details are. This is he's just spouting, so my belief is that that would interrupt reading, and that novels should have a minimum annotation possible. But I will once in a while insert an explanation. The intention was to set the city itself as a background and the history of the city. Basically, I'm going to represent just the first book, 1918, just post-revolution, and maybe stop and then just the beginning of the second part. So this is book 1, section 9. Goga, who is Olga's younger brother, has come to say goodbye. I came to see you, Olga, to beg your forgiveness. Forgiveness? Don't frighten me, Goga. And Olga tragically screws up the brow above her laughing eye. So where are you heading? To the River Don. To join General Alexeyev's army? Olga looks over at her brother as though at a co-conspirator. Goga, are you? And suddenly, for no apparent reason, she throws her feet up and begins to gaggle, kicking the air like a dog wagging its tail. Goga, a sweet and beautiful boy, he's 19. His lips are always aggrieved looking and rosy, his eyes golden like the evaporated cream from free-range cows, with big green unhappy eyes. Olga, please understand, I love my country. Olga ceases thrusting her feet at the air, turns to face him and says in all seriousness, Goga, this is all because you didn't finish high school. Goga's aggrieved lips look even more pained. Olga, only scum would persist in solving algebra problems in time of war. Goodbye. He offers me his hand with its soft womanly fingers, not even fingers, but little fingerlings. I squeeze them tightly. Until we meet again, Goga. He waves his head, splashing the golden bangs of his evaporated cream. No, goodbye. And he sticks out his rosy, like a girl's pouting lips. We kiss. Till we meet again, Goga. Why do you insist on upsetting me, Vladimir Vasilievich? I would be immensely happy to die for Russia. Poor angel. He will most certainly be gunned down like a grouse. Goodbye, Goga. This is section 11, so I've skipped the sort of what's going on, the little newsreel bit. And this is the section that introduces his brother, the Bolshevik. My older brother, Sergei, is a Bolshevik. He lives in the Hotel Metropole, directs water supply and distribution, having been an archaeologist. Drives around in a 6-seater automobile unpumped up as though bloated from hydrocephaly tires, and dines on 2 potatoes he fries up with the self-important air of a chef. Sergei has happy blue eyes and a teenager's protruding ears. Just you see, he will flap them bird-like, and his head with its silky blue eyes will fly off. Over the surface of entire right cheek is a large pinkish mark. From early childhood, Almost annually, Sergei was put on the operating table so that, having with great care selected a place that had not yet been touched by the surgeon's blade, a bloody piece of skin could be carved out. The excised healthy tissue would be placed like a patch over the diseased cheek. Each time, the wolf bitch would eat away at the patch. I came to see you on a business matter. Would you please write for me an official note so that they might give me a security pass to the public library? What do you need the library for? So I can cleanse it of all dust. Go to the ruins of one, and then wipe away the dust there. All right, I don't need it then. Sergei sits down at the table and composes a note. I start up a conversation on the subject of the just suppressed Moscow uprising of the leftist SRs. That's the Socialist Party who had come to control the government in a brief democratic election. About the fate of the 17-year-old black-bearded youth who, in order to save Russia's honor, threw a bomb into the German embassy. About Mirbach's passing, about the desire of the SRs by any means necessary to start up some sort of murderous mayhem with Germany. Not all the dust has settled yet. They still stop the automobiles in the suburbs and detain you in accordance with Lenin's order of a threefold background check. The checkpoint barriers are still in place along the highway, and the armed squads of workers are still in camp beside each of these around their nighttime campfires. In order to annoy Sergei, I continue on about the SRs. You know what? I genuinely like these Scythians with their orange umbrellas and worn through rubber boots. It's quite romantic the way bombs weigh down their pockets, the pockets of their raggedy cotton ponchos. Olga expressed herself quite well about the SRs. They all resemble Argoga. It's as though they also never finished high school. Sergei scratches with the dried-out quill against the edge of the writing table. He resembles a large shaggy hound, of whom one might think that he is friendly even with the black cats. You see, the thing is, this isn't romantic. It's a farce. By the way, in politics, these are one and the same thing. The darkness falls upon Theater Square in soft gray clumps. Their commanding officer, Muravyov, ran off to Simbirsk on the third day, and from there announced no more and no less than a declaration of war against Germany. It's silly, but he must be shot. The garden, the benches, the wire-thin trees, and the occasional human figures below are blanketed by the autumn dusk. I stare into Sergei's dreamy eyes with my own, cold, unflinching, indifferent, like the greenish, rust-tinged water of September. It is unbearable how much I want to infuriate him, get him riled up, beside himself. The SRs, Muravyev, Germans, war, revolution, it's all rubbish. Sergei bats his feathery eyelashes. And what isn't rubbish then? My love. Below in the theater square, the occasional street lights are smoking up their cigarettes. Let's suppose that your socialist proletarian revolution is ending and I am loved. Among the clouds, a fat German cigar flares up. A tragic ending, and I am bathing in my happiness, swimming up to my belly, letting out snorting noises in the rosy water, sending up bubbles through all my hidden places. Sergei exhumes the papers from his briefcase. In soft gray clumps. Well, brother, threading water with you, one may as well trample into poison ivy and sit down. And he stretches himself to full height. Go home. I have work to do. Every night in silence, so as not to wake Olga, I go out of the house and wander around the city. As a result of my happiness, I have insomnia. Moscow is dark and soulless, as it was 5 centuries ago, when the town's streets were shuttered by gates for the night, their locks guarded by gatekeepers. I find comfort in this darkness and desertedness because I can enjoy my good fortune without fear of being mistaken for an idiot. If we are to take the honorable English counselor at his word, Ivan the Terrible decided to teach my ancestors how to smile. With this in mind, during his walks or rides through town, he ordered to chop off the heads of those who came in his sight whose countenance he disliked. But even such decisive measures did not bring about the desired effect. Our character remained lightless. If a person walks around with a happy face, people will point their fingers at him. But love has split my physiognomy from ear to ear with a smile. If it were day, boys would be chasing after me now. Tiny specks of starlight peek through the sieve of the dentition of Kremlin's wall. Looking at the Ivanov column erected by Godunov, I involuntarily compare it to my elation. I feel compelled to ring all the bells so that every dog living in this insane city, spread out like Roman Byzantium over 7 hills, knows about the momentous event that is my love. It is exactly then that I ask myself the following disgusting little question. What precisely is going on? Why exactly are you hankering after Ivan the Fool's bell tower? Isn't its Lombard Byzantine style far too ecstatic for you? The depressing little answer reveals a concrete enough meaning. That's the kind of man you are. To you, not even the stink that issues from your lowly person seems despicable. Quite the opposite. It tickles your self-adoring fancy. Sections from the end of the first chapter. Of the Moscow conflagration of 1445, the chronicler wrote, "The entire city burned down so that not a single timber remained, but the churches of stone collapsed and the city walls crumbled." 47. And this is only a part of 47, the end. And aren't we, after all, the most atrocious people on this earth? It's not for nothing that in his book of precious records, the Arabian scribe wrote, "None of the Russians defecate alone. 3 of his comrades invariably accompany him, so as to guard him. They always carry swords upon their persons, for they trust each other little, and also because deviousness is commonplace between them. If but any of them succeeds in acquiring even the least bit of property, then even his own brother or friend that very moment begins to envy him and strive to determine how he might kill or rob him. The tepid Cossack's son reminds me of a child's cheerful toy bladder. Some little snot-nosed kid let go of the string and a little yellow balloon flew up toward the stars. At the corner, a coachman dozes. A withered nag looks up at me with her apathetic eye, polished to a sheen like a bog oak. Well, a horse couldn't care less, of course. The yard, melancholy and brown complexion, like a pharmacist's assistant. On all 4 sides, the grim, imposingly high walls. Without any little stucco figurines, hooks, or curlicues, the old nag hobbles past the gates. The drunk floozy hawks a massive loogie and sings. "You are," she says, "a cheeky bugger," she says. "There are quite a few," she says, "who are just like you. And yet," she says, "I love you still," she says, "even though you are a cheeky bugger." I climb up the dark staircase, rusted iron railings, worn down and mucked up stone steps and wooden doors of strangers' apartments, decorated with a fringe of cheap peeling oilcloth and colored by boredom. The stars peek in through the murky window glass. I feel too sluggish to drag myself up yet another 2 set of stairs. What if I just do it from the 5th floor? Well, thank you for your patience. I'm curious to hear your thoughts and questions.
Thank you, Alex. That was fabulous. I think it was great. The first part was great, so recognizable. I heard it many times in Russian and in English, and yet every time Staruха is terrific, and you just did it. And
Right. I think you got a sense. I got exactly to the middle of it, skipping the second part.
yeah, I just love the way you introduced people to Mariengof and to Cynics. I think it will make people very curious about this work, and I hope that this work will be published in English. We do have it in Russian for those who read Russian, and I just reread it, and it's fabulous.
I worked on it for 2 years for Columbia University Press's Russian library, and I still could not pass through peer review. There were 9 board members. I could never get a majority. The 2 outside peer reviews were split. One loved it, one didn't. The objection was, he is so lyrical, and these paragraphs go on for so long that the structure of it requires endless revision to read like English. With Harms, it's a little bit different. He is so colloquial and natural, right, that it's hard to represent it in colloquial English. There's a question about, thank you. So you're not entirely correct about these never being translated. They were in a Russian magazine from the 80s. This novel, well, I think pretty much, I'm not sure if it's in its entirety, but it was in Glass 1. A novel Without Lies was in Glass 23. They're long out of print. Do you have Glass? The old issues of Glass magazine?
Oh, no, we don't have the old issues. We have the new publication. We, not to my knowledge.
Glass started publishing again?
No. We have the publication of just the novel Without Lies. There's been new publications in Russian and in English, but not the old magazine. However, we have several offices, and we have an office in Moscow, and they specialize in the search for rare publications. So I think we might be able to find it.
And I'm a Chinese history specialist, so I know very little about Russian Soviet history, but I found this his comments about translation very interesting, because I do translation, English to Chinese or Chinese to Japanese. I speak 3 languages, and I think what he seems to be facing is vis-a-vis Columbia University Press is every translator's nightmare. Sounds like, that you can never satisfy the level of annotation, level of how much structural changes you can make and should not make. Yeah, so I was curious about more details about that.
I'll very briefly, right,
Mm.
there are 2 competing theories of translation. One is the domestication, to make it familiar, right? And that is generally what is practiced. So Constance Garnett, they're still so eminently readable, but that's Constance Garnett. That's Victorian literature. She made it for her age. It still applies because it was smooth equivalent, right? So the other one, right, the resisting domestication, which is actually kind of now back, in demand, essentially restoring originals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, right, so for example, Dostoevsky. Well, the thing you understand about Russian literature is that editors don't edit. In America, the budget for editing is much bigger than and production is much bigger than the one for the translator, for the translation, marketing, etc., right? An author gets $1 per book. There are parts that are badly written. They're intentionally difficult. They're intentionally, disorganized, as thoughts are. They are ungrammatical. Russian paragraphs do not respect American punctuation. The order of, this lyrical order of clauses is not, again, smooth, and so on. So it is always a compromise.
Yeah, I agree, I think, yeah, but I wish you good luck with that,
So this is wonderful for me. I can't thank you guys all enough, because I actually was so frustrated that a year ago I stopped. I did it for 10 years, almost full time, and I took a break. And in a way, this is my return to the work.
I think it's a part of a creative process when we put things away for a while and then come back and something new develops and comes out of it. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I could go on and on about the art of translation, but a translator rewrites, or a translator is a writer. And I don't mean rewriting, I literally mean writing it again in a different language, right? And so much of it is about the rhythm of speech, right? Getting it right in a different language. And so, for example, with this is like a sort of a theoretical argument to make for Mariengof, is that he is so effusive, right? And because English is so much more precise, I actually had to insert, I find myself having to do that often, to like add a little word simply to have that same, same lyrical rhythm to maintain the spirit of it, rather than the exact accuracy down to the word. I think prose rhythm is very important, and it takes endless revision, and it never ends. I'm sure all of us who have had books published would kill for an opportunity for a second edition.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah, I think in a way it's a terrific opportunity to read the text, whether it's written by you
Yes.
or an author or as a translator aloud, because that gives
Aloud.
you a different perception of the sound and the rhythm. Yeah. Well, I think we were very lucky to experience it here for the first time. I like the rhythm.
So, any thoughts about this idea in terms of annotation? How much annotation should be given?
I used to be a teacher of music history, and I've studied Russian and read some Kharms in Russian and some in English. I love Russian literature. I'm not familiar with Mariengof, and I really appreciate what you're doing. I'm sure you've already thought of this, but I think this is the ideal situation to just put your annotations as endnotes. That way it won't disturb the flow of reading. And that's the sort of thing for those that are really interested or want to know more about the context. That seems a good way to do it.
I will tell you that even with academic publishers, my experience has been at polar opposites.
Oh, really?
So yeah, so Columbia University is likely to want those because the peer reviewers want that. Northwestern does not. They want it to be much more of a pop. So theirs is called a World Classics series.
I know their stuff.
And so they for the Kharms,
right,
they basically said, make it your own, and it's while it's for course adaptation, their intention is a more broad audience, and they were not interested in all the.
In other words, they want no notes whatsoever, no context whatsoever, except the introduction.
I provide only what advances, what is relevant to the main action. Do you know what I'm saying? Like who the SRs were.
I mean, I was going to say this reminds me of a parallel situation with Borges, who is extremely elusive and draws on a vast literature, some of it quite explicit and some of it not so much, but kind of esoteric. So
the challenge with this was actually was one of diction. I didn't do it. If I was in person, I probably would have done it. But every other paragraph, there are long quotations. So that was actually like a popular song that was being sung, right? These sources, right? And I actually didn't get to a lot of these. He's constantly citing medieval chronicles and so on, and they're in quotations, and the diction is of the time, which for Russian is, I can't even.
It sounds virtually impossible.
But there's so many of these layers from different sources that it was a fun challenge. So, for example, 19th century regional colloquialism, for example, the novelist is Lyskov. There are several novelists that he's his favorite novelist that he's constantly citing, right? I did it in Cockney. Just to give you an indication, right? So I find that, and this applies generally to translation, is that you basically through trial and error settle on a strategy, and then more or less try to apply that strategy, as long as it's like does not seem out of place. So I had to translate 18th century oaths to Catherine the Great in hexameter. Well, there is no hexameter in the English language.
Not much.
No. So who are the only sources? I had to go back to Elizabethan post, basically, Pope and, right?
Yeah, well, people like Pope, then they translate Homer in hexameter.
Exactly. Sources are similar, right? But the only way to capture in English was to go back to Pope.
And maybe for the medieval chronicles, you'd have to, go to medieval English.
Exactly. But by the way, one of the greatest things that will now require research and revision is the description of medieval architecture. Again, for a lot of these things, I don't know. I was going to read you that part because, again, it's just so beautiful. So the Streltsy were a Russian honor guard who had rebelled against Ivan the Terrible and were executed. So I'll go ahead and read this, literally just like a paragraph. So, I no longer recall in what chronicle it was I read that before one of Moscow's worst conflagrations, when the fire flowed a river and the stone walls unraveled, iron turned crimson hot as in a furnace, copper streamed and the trees burned down to charcoal and the grass turned to ashes. Then too the ravens cawed heart-rendingly above the facade, the walls, and above the Kremlin and in the burbs beyond the rivers and in all of the countryside. And he's constantly inserting these paragraphs, so I'll just for like one more. When the jig of the Kremlin's invincible pendulums was up, I thought to myself how well it would be to witness in my life half as much as did our citadel with its heavy towers, thick walls, and twin-horned merlins, which still bore the traces of the rusted hooks on which the Streltsy heads had been impaled, this being the true origin of the old saying, for each merlin a marksman. Right, meaning that the marksmen were not aiming out of the merlins. They were hanging, their heads were hanging on them. And this is just a constant thing that he's drops. That wasn't the section about the architecture. There's a paragraph in here that simply, in medieval language, describes the architecture.
Of course, there's no, perfect translation. There's no translation that couldn't have been done another way, like you said yourself.
Or different way by the same person.
Yeah, no, I was thinking of,
step in the same room.
What's his name, Michael, the fellow who translates Hölderlin, he's done, Michael Hamburger, he's done over and over again, or Paul Celan also have been done many times. And of course, people like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy have been done so many different times. But I like that you are able to have some of that colloquial flavor in the Kharms. I
think that is actually my priority. I do tend towards a kind of appropriation in a sense that and partly maybe because my biggest prospects have been with Northwestern, and that's the editor's priority there, is to make it available to an English reader. It should be natural.
I have something to say here regarding the footnotes. As you probably know, some of you know, Alex for sure, there is a certain place for it in Russian classics like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. You can't imagine reading Tolstoy without a page being split. I mean, that's how you read, because there's always a footnote, because of French, of course, but occasionally in a more modern publication, there will be explanations of what is what, because the words are outdated. So as a Russian-speaking child, you grow up having the page split in two, and the footnote is something that is very common. I know that it influenced me because I wrote my first novel with footnotes. It's just such a part of it. So, but on the other hand, there is the whole idea of preserving the text on the page, especially the text like Mariengof's, just the way it is, because it's split in small pieces and it's sparse.
And it's visual, and it's intended to be as well visual. The other thing I wanted to add is, I think, well, certainly most of us, and I mean us by not Russians, actually, were probably introduced to Russian literature in college, and so we've read most of these in the Norton books, and so we are expecting annotation.
So one way or another, just come with annotations after all. But in this case, endnotes seem to be a legitimate idea or an option, because it wouldn't change the look of the page, because the look of the page for this novel is almost like poetry. It has a...
I understand. Yeah. The other issue then is page as actually the cost involved. It again, you have to settle somewhere. So, for example, right? I mean, I'm just saying again, it's a cost. There's a cost benefit analysis. We were at the Northwestern Harms book. We were able to make it 260 pages long, right? And still, we weren't able to include everything I wanted to include. It makes a novella is cheaper to produce. Cheaper. More people can afford it. Makes it more accessible and so forth. So there is a cost benefit analysis involved as well. So yeah, the whole footnote thing. I think it was it Kaczynski's last novel that was all footnotes, about 800 pages of them. He just took exegesis to its extreme. It was Kaczynski's last novel that nobody probably ever read. And then he committed suicide.
Has translation influenced your writings or yourself? The act of translation, has it had impact on you as a writer or poet?
Yes. I am no longer a writer or poet. I literally set that aside for a decade. This fulfills me aesthetically.
Okay.
As a writer. And there's simply no time. It's so hard for me to do this and then barely make a living as an adjunct and freelancer, that there's no time left over. Okay. And I've also been genuinely, for full 10 years, I was genuinely driven, working nearly full time. I can't even tell you how many books I've completed. I have a 260 page essential Mandelstamm, for example. Okay. So I kind of feel like I've done everything I set out to do. Probably I'll stop unless like I have some great success. I'll probably stop translating and start writing poems again.
Because I know that Japanese writer Murakami Haruki, who started out as a translator and became a very famous novelist, says that translation really impacts him. Just because translation is an act of, I think, well, I'm just, guessing. Translation is an act of seeing the writing inside out, right? I mean, so much about that writing or anything by translating rather than just reading, right? Because you think so much about it and you focus on every word. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just
so
eventually.
So I'll say a couple of things about that. So there, besides the monetary and survival practical issues, there's also, which is probably something more important, is the need to be wanted and needed. Editors actually want me and need me. People solicit work. It may not pay, it may pay, but I have a closer relationship with editors than with other writers for that reason. And I actually do a lot of like guest editing and so forth, right? Because it's more academic. So, and that's why actually I stopped, you know, I threw myself into it because I kind of reached a dead end with the poet, right? As a poet, right? And there was a need for this, and my timing was good. I won't go into the sort of like the politics of translation, but I think everyone knows that there's been a flowering of translation, especially in Russian, this sort of like silver age of Russian translation. And so, and the other thing is, I said that this is aesthetically fulfilling, right? To me, it fulfills the same need as for a writer. So I would just add that as partly comical, but partly too. Other translators, academics who I very much respect, who respect my work, have said that everything I translate comes out sounding like me. I'm fully satisfied aesthetically with this work. I don't see myself being able to go back to it unless I drop this. No, I have no idea what the future will bring.
Well, Ardis is the publishing house, and we have a lot of their books in the store.
Have you sold
many? Translations were not that great, but they did provide a wonderful service for the immigrants.
They're lousy.
Yeah.
They're lousy. Sorry, I'm about to say that because I love the proffers. I had proffer for his last class. He died on us teaching Dostoevsky. And then I worked for Landeia at Ardis in the 80s. So I loved them, but they didn't know Russian very, very well. Brodsky told them what to publish, who didn't know much about translation either. And again, they did not really care about the quality of the translations. I will continue with this. So I made it my mission to resurrect artists, sort of like writing, and then Overlook Press acquired it. And I kept writing to Overlook Press for 10 years saying, when are you going to republish Artists? Never heard back from them. They own all those editions. Oh, they're part of Overlook Press now. They're worthless. No, someone's got to start a new one.
Well,
what are we gonna call it, Zarina? Globus?
Globus, why not? I'll talk to people.
You'll be the new City Lights, the Russian City Lights.
Yeah. Zarina, may I ask you? I'm assuming you have Kharms and Mariengof at Globus in San Francisco.
Yes, we do. We have Kharms in English and in Russian, and literary scholarship works about Kharms. Mariengof currently we only have in Russian, and I wasn't able to find Cynics in English. They exist. There is a publication, but
Glass One.
Yeah.
Glass One.
And I can't. So far, I couldn't find it to resell, but I'm still looking. And then the novel Without Lies is possible to get. So if you're interested, just drop a line, and then we search for books that will.
Oh yeah, I live in San Francisco. Actually, I grew up a few blocks from your store.
Right.
So
well,
I don't know.
Stop by. Don't be a stranger.
Okay, I wanted to know if you're still open in the age of COVID.
Oh, very much so. Not very much so for now. Curbside delivery, but starting on Monday, we're opening the doors, and you can come in and browse, and we'll have a perfect social distance talk, and I will give you the books, and everybody's welcome. Well, this has been marvelous, and I'm sure there are more to this, and I like to make a mental note for more talks in the future. And I know we can talk about literary translation forever, but at this point, I would just like everybody to know that you are very much appreciated, everybody who came to listen here and on YouTube. And Alex, thank you very much for your work, for excellent translations, and for introducing us the work that is little known. Thank you.
Thank you, Zarina. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Good evening.
All right. Thank you. Stay safe, and we'll see you all soon. We have good talks coming, so come visit Globus or Globus YouTube.
Thank you.
Bye.